What can you add to your bookshelf that will encourage your children to read? Today, I wanted to do a quick video on things you could add to your child's bookshelf that will encourage and motivate them to read. You might have several of these already, in which case absolutely fantastic, but there might be one or two that you've not thought of or that you could expand on in your own lives with your own bookshelves, whether you are at home or in a classroom. If there's anything else that I don't cover in this video that you think is absolutely vital to have in your bookshelf at home, please leave them in the comments down below, because we can build on that from each other and work together to create amazing bookshelves for all of our kids. So let's get started. Why is it really important that our kids have bookshelves? There's an incredible statistic that shows that kids that have just 20 books in a bookshelf of their own that they can reach will achieve up to 3 years more education than kids that have no access to books at all. This can sound a bit misleading because it can sound like you have to go out and buy loads and loads of books for your kids, but actually the library is an incredible resource, and if your child has access to those 20 books that they feel like they can read at any time, they will have the same impact as if your child has 300 books on their bookshelf. So don't feel that because of this video you have to rush out and get loads and loads of resources to include in your bookshelf, but hopefully I will give you some ideas of things that you can access, things that you can get that will help your child become motivated to read, improve their reading skill, and gain those extra years of education that they otherwise might not reach. Another thing I want to mention before we get started is that if you can make the books accessible to your child, literally by putting them at child height. So I've got my bookshelf here, but I've also got bookshelves up around the walls. The ones that are higher up are ones that the kids couldn't reach by themselves. If they want me to get a book from there and they want me to read it to them, they have to ask. Now, that sounds like such a small thing, but actually just being able to reach over here and access it themselves, pick up and open it and read it themselves without asking for an adult's help is going to improve their motivation, improve their enthusiasm for reading, because they can access it. It's something that they are able to achieve by themselves without an adult's help. This is also a fantastic motivating factor. So there are just two things to think about before we get into the books. Firstly, make sure your child has access to books either through a library, but also if you can put books at child height, your children will be much more likely to access them. They'll be much more motivated to read, and they will be improving their reading much more quickly, simply because we've taken out that step of having to ask an adult for support. So let's get into talking about what we can put on our bookshelves. First off is the obvious ones, storybooks. Now, this is very obvious. Most people will have storybooks on their bookshelves, so I'll whiz through this one quite quickly, but it is still important to mention. By having access to storybooks, your children can not only learn brand new stories, learn story structure, learn sentence structure, all of those incredible things, but they're also able to open the book, look at the pictures and tell the story themselves, which again helps with all of those things we talked about. So having a few storybooks on your child's shelf is fantastic, particularly if you can find things that your child is particularly interested in, whether that be fantasy stories, stories about people's lives, dinosaurs or volcanoes or unicorns, whatever it is. If you can find some stories that your child really, really loves, that they love to read over and over again, fantastic. Include that into your bookshelf so that your child has access to those, can keep building up that story structure as they go. Next, I want to talk about non-fiction books. Again, this is quite obvious, so I will do it quite quickly, but having some non-fiction books on your child's shelf is such a valuable way of encouraging them to read, particularly if they're a child who doesn't particularly like made-up stories. Using things that are of their interest that they can dive into in a bit more depth is such a fantastic way of getting them to read. Now, I've chosen a bee book because bees are my favourite animal. I absolutely love them. If you presented me with this book as a child, I would be really keen to read it because it's got a bee on the front cover and it tells me things about something that I'm really passionate about. A couple of years ago when I was teaching, I had a little boy who hated reading. It was so hard for him because when our kids start learning to read, it really is hard. There's so much that they have to do, so much that they have to keep in their brains and keep working on. He was really, really adamant that he didn't want to read. In my bookshelf, I had a non-fiction book all about dogs and different dog breeds. He picked it up one day and he was looking through the different pictures of dogs and he said to me, "I really like dogs. What's this type?" And I went, "Oh, I don't know. Can you read it and find out?" And he read Poodle. I went, "Oh, brilliant, that's poodle. What can we tell you about poodles?" And he took the book home and he worked really, really hard. And he came back the next day and told me loads of facts about poodles. He became really enthusiastic about reading. He really wanted to read more and more. The fiction books wouldn't have helped him. He wouldn't have been interested because they're not about topics that he cared about. Whereas that non-fiction book sparked his love of reading, and from there he could go the distance. He built up that light bulb moment, which we are all searching for, where they're suddenly like, "Oh my gosh, I can read," and reading gives me something back. So that's why non-fiction books are a really valuable thing to add to your home library. And as I say, this is another library book. Pop to your library, ask your librarian, what non-fiction books do you have? What books do you have about bees? What books do you have about dinosaurs? And they're all incredible people. They will be able to help you. As a quick segue on from the non-fiction books, it is also a fantastic way to teach about diversity in the world and help our children feel more comfortable in the world that we live in. So I just wanted to show you one of my non-fiction books, which are actually, it's written in the form of a story, so that you can introduce your children to the idea of Mae Jemison, who was the first Black woman in space. And then you can encourage your child to read through that, learn a bit more about history, and build on their understanding of the world from the non-fiction books. So I just wanted to add that in there. Next, I want to talk to you about a type of book that you may not have thought of before. I have an absolute passion for comic books, particularly when it comes to encouraging our kids to read. And I will be doing a much longer deep dive on why comic books are so important for our kids in a later video, I'm sure. With all the research and all the statistics and all the amazing things that I love doing work on. But I did want to include it because with comic books, it feels like they're not having to read as much, but they are still getting a lot out of them. If you have a reluctant reader or a struggling reader, they can still read through the book, they can still get a good storyline, but they're not having to read as much in order to get the same amount. The other advantage to comic books is that they have a huge expanded vocabulary. So there are more strange words in comic books than you would find in a normal novel. And so if you are working on expanding your child's vocabulary, you want them to be more confident in vocabulary, exposed to new words. Comic books are a really, really great way of doing that. And what's wonderful is, so this is a standard comic book that you can get from the library, but what's wonderful is some of the old favourites are being converted into comic books as well. So your children can still access books that maybe older children are reading, or if they are older themselves, they can still access the same books that others are reading. But again, they're not having to do as much reading to get the information out. They're different levels, so you don't just have to read very basic comic books, you can expand it upwards, but they're not just superheroes. Not that there's anything wrong with those. I love a superhero comic book, but you can have a huge range of comic books as well. And I would really recommend going to your library, asking for comic books there, or just typing them into Google and having a look at those. Because again, it's very accessible for your children to just pick up off the bookshelf, read to themselves, talk about the pictures, discuss the story, so they have that sense of independence and self-motivation over the books. Now we're starting to get into the slightly more rogue inclusions to your bookshelf. And the first one of those is basic recipe books. Now, recipe books are fantastic because not only do you get to read them, do you get to look at the pictures, do you get to use comprehension skills with children that are very early on in their reading journey, because, for example, you can open this up and you can say, oh, look at the picture. What do you think they're making in that recipe? You can also use the recipe to create whatever in the picture, which helps your child understand why we learn to read, why it's so important that we learn to read, and they can get a bit more out of why they have to learn, because they can look at a picture, they can go, oh, actually, that looks like something I want for breakfast. And then you can read together. They can read the numbers, they could read short words or any words that you think they can manage, and then you can work together to make that meal. And that's a fantastic way of encouraging them to start reading, encouraging them to get things out of reading as well. On a similar note, art books are fantastic. Now, I actually don't have an art book at home at the moment. I only have a sewing book. But again, this is fantastic because you can open it up to one of the patterns, you can talk about the patterns, you can talk about what you can see, you can read part of the book to your child can copy the patterns. If you have an art book, a basic art book, that's even better because they tend to have step-by-step image instructions with the words underneath, so your child can follow along with the images and they can try and read it underneath if they're at that level, or you can try reading it to them. But again, they get something physical out of reading, so they get that reward for starting that reading. Another great thing to include are old newspapers and magazines. Obviously, you might want to have read them already to check that they are age appropriate. But even if you take really old magazines like this one, it's fantastic for engaging your child, talking about history, talking about things that came from the past. I mean, this is a really, really old knitting magazine that I've had for years now, and I've spoken to my children about it, spoken about the patterns and how you could make these things yourself and that they're all in black and white, and can we read some of the words? It's just something a bit different that your child can pick up, have a flick through, get interested not just in reading but also in history. Why is it like that? Where did that come from? And again, it's something else that you can add to your bookshelf that doesn't have to be a plain old book and can give your child so many extra things. The other advantage is that you can get child magazines and child newspapers. I know the charity Bookmark in the UK does a fantastic comic book-ish magazine for kids and for adults as well. So you could absolutely take that, put that in your bookcase for your child to flick through. If you are someone who still reads the newspaper, or if your parents still read the newspaper, it's another great way of helping your child model themselves after someone else, because they look at someone else, they want to do the same thing. If they have a children's magazine, they can do exactly the same thing, which will encourage them to read. Things that are also really useful that might seem a little rogue are things like junk mail. So things might come through the door that have writing on them that you can talk to your child about what they mean, what they do, what do they tell us, and put that in your bookshelf, and your child can use that for their free play, for their role play, but also, again, for that motivation, for that understanding that we read all the time, every single day, and that reading is a really important skill that they need to learn. So I've got a few things here as an example. I've got a missed post thing, I've got my boiler check, and I've got a few information pamphlets for my George Foreman and my old cooker. So again, just put them in. Your child can flick through, they can look at the pictures, they can understand why it is so important that we need to learn to read. So those are the basics that I would include on my child's bookshelf or my classroom's bookshelf. But in a second, I'm going to talk about a few extra rogue things that you can include or that you can encourage your child to read that are not just books and don't actually involve the bookshelf. One of the other things you can encourage your child to read that you might not be doing at the moment are things like Facebook posts and Instagram posts. As social media is growing and building, it's really important that we talk to our children about it, that we introduce our children to it in a way that is safe and controlled. And one of the best ways to do this is to encourage them to read through the Facebook posts that we've already vetted, that we've already seen, and that we know are safe for our kids to read. For example, in a couple of months, I'm going to be going to the Children's Expo in London Olympia. So excited. But I can show that post to the kids. We can watch the video, we can read the information underneath it, and we can talk about why has someone made this Facebook post? Why is it there? What is it for? And we can also then lead on to that wonderful talk about internet safety and what we share online and whether it's deletable and things like that, which is another really important thing to do with our kids. Equally, just doing things like putting subtitles on when your child is watching the TV or YouTube is a fantastic way of helping them read passively because they're listening to the words and they are also reading the words as they go. And finally, the other thing we want to do is point out words wherever we are. So if we're walking down the street, we want to be pointing out street signs, signs above cafes, literally the letters on a car. All of that is helping our children understand that words are literally everywhere. We have to read as part of life, not just as an optional extra. It's really important that our children learn that we're not just teaching them to read so that they can read storybooks. We're teaching them to read so that they can be part of life and part of society and gain that confidence to be part of that world. Helping our children see that reading is literally everywhere is a vital step to that and so valuable. Ultimately, the message of this video is that all reading is good reading. If your child loves non-fiction books, if your child will only read comic books, if your child loves reading the junk mail that comes through your door, all of that is fantastic reading. Whatever they are reading is amazing. And the more we can encourage our kids to find things that they love, find books that they are particularly passionate about, the more they will want to read and the more they will want to build that reading skill over time. I hope you found this video interesting and useful, and you've hopefully come away with a few ideas of extra things you can keep on your child's bookshelf that will help encourage and motivate them to read a bit more. There goes the cat. If you've come across anything new that you think you could implement with your child and your child's bookshelf at home, I would absolutely love to hear from you. Please let me know down in the comments. Equally, if there's anything you think I've missed, if there's anything that you think is an absolute necessity for your child's bookshelf, you would never be without it, or just something extra that you think might be interesting to include, please let me know in the comments. I might do another video on slightly more of a deep dive if people want me to, including other things that other people have put in their bookshelves as well to help us all out. The more we can expose our kids to reading, the more they will want to read, the more they will find reading easy and be motivated to do so. So let me know your thoughts below. And if you've made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for sticking with me. If you feel like watching another video on building reading skills, this is my most recent video. Please click here and maybe subscribe if you feel like it. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful day and I will see you hopefully very soon.